Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Chatham House. My name is Adam Ward. I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute, and we're very pleased to have Sir Paul Tucker with us to discuss his book, which is going to be available later for purchase. You'll be pleased to hear, Paul. Unelected Power, the Quest for Legitimacy in Central Banking and the Regulatory State, which was published, I think, in May of this year. And I think it's fair to say that the book is part meditation and part manifesto. At the heart of it is this tension between the independence and the political accountability of central banks and other regulatory institutions as they go about discharging their various functions. And this matters, as the book argues, because of the very large powers these bodies have in many cases been invested with, and because of the discretionary nature of some of those powers. Those powers are exercised on economic grounds, but they have wide-ranging effects, and to that extent are not strictly apolitical. So the question that Sir Paul seeks to answer is, what's the formula for ensuring that institutions are protected from undue political interference, but are also underwritten, I should say, by political accountability and the legitimacy that comes from that, and the sustainability, ultimately, that comes from that. And, of course, it's an analysis that's all the more intriguing and compelling because it's made by a central bank insider. As you know, Sir Paul was Deputy Governor of the Bank of England after the 2008 crisis, and so he saw at very close quarters indeed how central banks and other institutions globally reacted under that immense pressure, but also what legacies their actions have produced and left us to wrestle with. So this discussion is on the record. It's also being live streamed. Sir Paul's going to be speaking to us from the lectern for about 15-20 minutes or so, and then we'll enter into a conversation together. So Paul, thank you very much for being here. I look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for giving up your lunchtime, or part of your lunchtime. And thank you very much to Chatham House for inviting me to speak about it. The book's got a very long subtitle about central banking, but really the subtitle, if it had the courage of my convictions, the subtitle would have been Why Technocracy Should Retreat to Preserve Our System of Government. The book is born out of a concern that most of us are of a certain age, that during our adult lifetimes, perhaps a little bit before, an extraordinary amount of power has been given to unelected people. Now, in the United States, that started at the end of the 19th century with a great boost in the 1930s, the New Deal period. But really here it comes from the 1990s, and it's associated here with two things. First of all, the rather idiosyncratic debate about the Bank of England and whether it should be independent. And then secondly, a fashion for the so-called new public management, which came from New Zealand, was embraced by the top mandarins here. So what we really need to do is give functions to agencies, get them out of get them off ministers' desks, and structure these agencies like public companies with a chief executive and a board and so on. And I'm going to be blunter than I am in the book. I mean, I think all of that's absolutely dreadful, actually, for reasons that I will describe. So it's a contribution to the debate about populism versus technocracy, and envisaged as such well before Trump was elected, but certainly influenced by the financial crisis and the sense of the inevitability of failure in any part of government, and when the responsibility lies with unelected people, as I think largely it did on both sides of the Atlantic. What a different world we live in, where you can't elect out the people that have let you down so badly. So the book starts. The central belief of the book is that representative democracy is special and that we have become careless about it. I think it's special in lots of respects, but I think the relevant sense for me in which it's special is that it brilliantly separates how we as citizens feel about the system of government from how we feel about the government of the day. Because if, as I assert, every part of government eventually messes up, and sometimes messes up in a massive way, it is absolutely marvellous that we can blame the people we've elected, vote them out, try the other side, and without our allegiance to the system of government being necessarily threatened at all, except that you couldn't vote me out, or the leaders of the FSA, or the leaders of Ofcom. The book was also prompted by my own experience in the last quite a few years of my career with the new powers coming to the Bank of England. The Bank of England is, even amongst central banks, it is an especially powerful central bank. And with Matt Hancock, who is the current Health Secretary, the truth is that I'm the main architect of that. Much of it dreamt up in Julie's wine bar in Holland Park over many years. He'd been my private secretary in the early zeros. And as I say in the preface, I leant against certain functions that people wanted to give us. Not ministers, but people who were hugely influential in the Tory party wanted the Bank of England to have even more functions. And I, with Mervyn's support, said no. And when sometime after I'd left, they were plainly reconsidering this. I was phoned by somebody, and they said, why did you say no to that? I said, oh, because you'd be too powerful. You'd just be too powerful for your own good and too powerful for the country's good. The other thing during the same period is we wanted the different functions of the Bank of England to be delegated to separate statutory committees. As well as a monetary policy committee, there's a financial policy committee, there's a prudential regulatory committee or authority. And each of them, I hope it's still like this, each of them has a majority of members who is only on that committee. So this was addressing the problem of when an agency or a business has more than one function or mission, its leadership will tend to make most effort on the mission that is most salient with the people. And monetary policy is more salient with the people most of the time than regulation, because you're doing it all of the time, and it affects people's mortgage payments and savings rates. And there's a terrific economics literature and political science literature on that. You can model that, and the facts bear out what I've just said. And what I wanted to do when I went to Harvard was write down what lay behind this focus on accountability and legitimacy and constraining power. And it ended up being, inevitably, I think, an exercise in constitutionalism. A really peculiar thing, away from the kind of surface phenomena of independent agencies, there is a kind of deep thing which is really strange and disturbing. If you think about the great thinkers of the 18th century and before, 17th century into the 19th century, who shaped the constitutional world in which we lived, they had no conception of agencies of any kind. I mean, the three-branch state is a product of the world in which they lived, and that's fine. But we have moved into this world without anybody asking the question, well, how do these things fit with our values of constitutionalism? And if you need persuading of that, I would encourage you next time you go into a bookshop with a law section and constitutional law and books on British constitutionalism. And the chap that there are quite a few such books over the last 20 years, because there have been big constitutional changes in this country, and they will be about the EU and devolution and moving the Supreme Court out of the House of Lords, and human rights. And there's sometimes one, in the most famous person's textbook, there's one sentence about the Bank of England, and I'm not sure there's even a sentence about the agencies. And yet, I will make an assertion, I'm not absolutely sure it's true of the UK, it's true of the US. The marginal lawmaker in the United States, and I think in the UK, is an unelected regulatory official. How about that? Imagine John Locke writing about that. Your lawmakers were not elected. And this mattered a lot for the central bank and the Bank of England, because we tend to think that regulations are kind of all techie, funny, obscure stuff. What it is it's writing laws that you can enforce with the coercive power, the monopoly coercive power of the state. And so what that means is that the standard arguments for monetary policy independence, central bank independence, which preoccupy people in economics departments, which is you want to get away from business cycles that go, not that we completely succeeded in doing that. They don't carry over in a completely straightforward way to, oh, now we'll let these people write our laws as well. So it is an exercise in trying to see how you could fill out or apply our constitutional values. I don't want to, for reasons I'll explain, I don't want to inject my own constitutional values, but taking what I discern to be our constitutional values, how would this bear on this world of independent agencies? So here's a fascinating thing. For those countries, and I'm only interested in healthy democracies, so advanced economy, healthy democracies, for those countries that have a written constitution, which is basically all of them other than us, none of them, with the exception of Germany, make any provision at all for the administrative state. And Germany does, and it's because it's, after the Second World War, it's the most recent written constitution of an advanced economy. It does make provision for the administrative state, and it is absolutely unambiguous on the matter. All administrative agencies, impliedly also the Bundesbank, shall be under ministerial control. So I say this because I'm not going to talk about it further today, but Germany has a completely different problem from the United States, the UK, and France. And it has a deeply embedded, entrenched constitutional provision about the administrative state. And its problem is that the facts on the ground don't actually match the de jure position, because I can assure you that I am quite away from the Bundesbank, which is a special case. I have worked with German administrative agencies which were not under day-to-day ministerial control, but were pursuing the policies devised by unelected officials. Let me, at this point, say, say how I define an independent agency. Say something about a few agencies here, and then say something about what I think the shape of the solution looks like. So by an independent agency, and this matters a lot more in the United States than here, because they use the expression independent agency in a really weird way. By an independent agency, I mean an agency that is insulated day to day from the politics of both the executive branch and the legislative branch. US legal scholars use it only to mean that the president can't sack you if he doesn't like what you look like. And they have very few independent agencies on my definition. We have lots and lots. And there are some kind of peculiar facts about them. For example, the Financial Conduct Authority, and before that, the Financial, what's it called, Services Authority, formally more independent than the Bank of England, of which there was no debate whatsoever when the legislation went through Parliament. All of the Ofs, Ofcom, and the various energy utility regulators, they all have high degrees of formal independence, but typically with override powers. And actually, in one case, the Ofgem, the governments have taken to re-legislating their objectives quite frequently, which has kind of rather undermined the point of the delegation. But the interesting one, the one I want to say something about, is Ofcom. So 25 to 30 years ago, there was a debate in France about whether or not it was safe in terms of our deep political values to have the independent agency that regulated the economics of the media and telecom also being the agency that regulated content. And they decided, after quite a debate, that that would not be safe, and that therefore you should have them separate. Here, we have them together, and the interesting point for me is that there was no debate about that point. So, including, amazingly, when the BBC governance was reformed a couple of years ago, what happened a couple of years ago, it was discussed and consulted on for that, following a report by David Clementi. The debate was all around, can we trust the BBC to carry on self-regulating? No was the consensus. Whether that's right or not, I don't care for my purposes, but no was the answer. Therefore, we need an independent, we don't want ministers doing that. Oh, absolutely not. Therefore, we need an independent regulator. Yes. Shall we set up a new independent regulator, or shall we have Ofcom? Terribly cumbersome to set up a new independent regulator. Let's use Ofcom. And what's amazing about it, the debate, is at no point in the debate, and someone challenged me on this, and I said, oh, send me all the submissions, which I'd actually already read, but I reread them to check. At no point in the debate did anyone say, is Ofcom fit for purpose to be the regulator of all of this, given that its structure is of a chief executive and then a part-time board. So I want to say something about these oversight boards at this point. This applies not only to Ofcom, but to the other Ofs. So I know many, I've had a privileged adult life. I know many of the people that sit on these boards. And I said to them, so are you involved in policy? Or is there only one policymaker at Off X? And they'd say, oh, we were involved. And I'd say, oh, that's interesting. Did you have a confirmation hearing in front of the relevant select committee? No. Are your votes on the decisions published, and do you give speeches on your votes? No and no. Do you regularly testify, or testify at all ever on the policy decisions that you have made as a member of the board? No. So then being very privileged in truth, of course I know a few cabinet ministers who have had responsibility under the current government and the previous one and the previous one. And I said, who is the policymaker at X? I'm not going to name the agency. And they would always name a person. And it would always be the Director General. Now, no one, during the period when Mervyn was in a minority on the Monetary Policy Committee, no one thought that Mervyn was the sole monetary policy maker. Indeed, when he was in the minority, he wasn't the policy maker. We'd cast him into some penumbra of attempted policy making. And it is amazing that this doesn't get debated. Whereas, in ministries, you have junior ministers have some clout. In cabinet, you have lots of people sitting around the table. In Parliament, you have, if you pass a law in Parliament, by definition, everybody in the House of Commons and in the second chamber can vote. How is it that we have ended up, without much public debate, having lawmaking under the control, de facto control of single people? I just think it's a great mistake and a violation of our values. So I'll say one more thing. I'll say something about the shape of the solution. And I think, by the way, this goes for the FSA and the FCA. I was ex officio on the board of the FSA, and as an oversight board in terms of management, it was not bad, not great, but there weren't many experts on financial regulation. Kind of like real experts that you'd want to decide policy with, and you think, but they were lawmakers. And if they're not going to be expert, why not have the House of Commons do it? Which is not where I want to end up. So why would you delegate to an independent agency at all, given what I was saying? It sounds absolutely, not only crazy, but terrible. Well, the argument that has tended to dominate the debate in the United States since the 1940s, and here up to a point, and by here I mean on the continent as well, is around expertise. And the fuss about Michael Gove's comments about experts kind of resonates with that. It's all about expertise. And James Landis, who was one of the big architects of the administrative state, the regulatory state in the United States, the architect of the SEC, early commissioner at the FTC, later a dean at the Harvard Law School. He wrote a book defending it more or less entirely in terms of expertise, and this just doesn't wash, because you could have independent committees of experts who give published expert advice to political decision takers. It's delegating expertise. Of course it matters. And you want to frame the issue and the range of options with expertise that is recognizably expert to a body of people outside the agency. But that doesn't mean that they need to decide. And the US has used that structure. They used it, Congress used it to help them decide which military bases to shut about 20 years ago, because they couldn't coalesce. No one wanted to close a military base in their own district or state, so they had a separate agent. They set up a commission to advise them, and then bound them, effectively took the advice. But here, more pertinently, monetary policy was run on that basis until 1997, from 1991 to 1997. And the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, operates on that basis and has changed the course of fiscal policy. And the OBR, by the way, is living evidence that you can get really good people to serve in advisory agencies, even if they don't take decisions. The lineup, the current lineup and the previous lineup in the OBR is good. I mean, so the argument that good people will only do it if you give them decision-making power isn't right. What I think independent agencies giving them decision-making power can do is it can help make the commitment to a policy objective credible. And this is, of course, is the motivation, the high-level motivation for monetary policy independence. And the same thing affects utility regulation. And it's why we have courts. The reason the court system is independent is we want to commit to fair adjudication and consistent adjudication over time and over different cases. That's an important commitment. Courts, the independent judiciary is a solution to a problem of commitment. And the idea of credible commitment is completely central to the book. But it obviously can't be all there is to be said, because commitment problems run through the whole of government. On that basis, we delegate absolutely everything to people like me, God help us. And instinctively we know that we don't want to delegate big distributional questions, and we don't want to delegate questions of our values. And of all countries in the world, we know this, because this is why Simon de Montfort and people in the centuries that followed wanted a parliament, that the king should not be able to decide taxation on his or her own. So where I ended up, and I'll mention three criteria that I think are terribly important and how they can be a bit of a problem. One is that you need a consensus around the purpose of the delegation. It's no good if there isn't a fairly deep consensus around that. So environmental policy is a good example where there isn't a consensus. I mean, in the United States, lots of people have been incredibly angry with the current environmental protection agency. But the truth is there are a load of people that are really pleased that the policies of the Obama administration are being diluted and even abandoned. Whereas there is not a constituency anywhere, I would say, for high and volatile inflation. Well, other than a few hedge fund guys, but who cares about them? And there is not a constituency out there for can we have more financial crises, or when we have them, can they please be deeper? I mean, there is a consensus where, we want a stable financial system, we want stability in the value of our money. But then, crucially, I think you want to set these agencies an objective that can be monitored, and not just monitored by the cognoscenti, but that people, the newspapers and commentators and Parliament can monitor whether or not you're achieving what you have been given to do. And that drive, that's quite restrictive. The other thing is whether it's our liberal political values or our Republican political values, we should want these bodies to be committees. Partly because you'll get better debate and so get better results. But it's partly also so that you don't concentrate power in one person's hands. I mean, Yeah, I've gone over this with Ofcom, but I think there's a kind of deeper thing here about, it's kind of Madisonian value about fragmenting power, and we should want to fragment power in our independent agencies. So I was dismayed, for example, recently when I saw that one of the big agencies, happened to be the one I worked in, has set up an enforcement committee so as to, with outsiders, so as to establish a separation from the investigation of a problem, from the decision on a problem. I think that's good. And then they appointed to this enforcement agency a member of the House of Lords, who's a legislator. I mean, this is absolutely crazy. I mean, not an ad feminem point. I mean, she's great, but it's absolutely. Imagine if there was legislation about regulation or the Bank of England going through Parliament while a case was coming up. This is the kind of thing that in the States and actually in Germany, somebody off the courts absolutely immediately to say, strike this out as a kind of conflicted procedure. And the final thing I'll mention is oversight by select committees, committees of Congress, on behalf of the public. But this actually is a bit of a constraint. A few years ago here, quite a few years ago, the chair of the Agriculture Committee, when asked about this, said, we have more bodies to oversee than it is possible for us to do properly. To which my response is, well, we should not have more independent agencies than parliamentary committees are capable of overseeing. And if that means that in the short run policy is done less well because it is under the control of ministers, by my lights, not everyone would agree with this, by my lights, that is better than having an agency that decides, but the relevant select committee has no time to oversee them, no time to have hearings until something eventually goes wrong. But what are those select committee hearings for? I will end with an anecdote, which forms the quote at the top of one of the chapters. So Mervyn and I were testifying on monetary policy. And George Moody, who was the ranking Labour member, who was great actually, although you could never say that to them. I mean, he was quite scary. But he said, Mr. King, or Mr. Governor, Mr. Tucker, you come here and we ask you these questions, and you give these eloquent, elegant answers, and then you go back to your building and none of it makes any difference whatsoever. I mean, what is the point? What is the point of all of this? Which, sounds funny now. I tell you, it wasn't bloody funny sitting there. What is the reason? I mean, and the reason is, what we each said, was, you, Parliament, made us independent. So long as you leave that law in place, it is our duty to go back and decide what we each think is right. And what these hearings are for is so that you can decide whether the system should be sustained or whether to change it, whether to get rid of it or to amend it in some way. And it's our duty, I'm now adding this next bit, it's our duty to tumble out as much as we possibly can of our thought process so that you can see whether this was indeed what you intended. And that doesn't always work well. So I'm going to say one other thing, which is the debate about quantitative easing. I think we, as I then was, we were slow to talk in public about the distributional effects. We were slow to talk to ourselves about the distribution effects. In 2012, the Select Committee said, rather pointedly in public, go and write a paper on that. And although I feel, God, we should have got there first, how terrific that they made the Bank of England do that. And before it happened in the States and before it happened in the ECB. Actually, the quality of the Treasury Select Committee of Bank of England, monetary policy at least, is pretty good. Much better than Congress of the Fed. But it relies on bodies like this, think tanks and the media, to ensure that the politicians oversee the system well. And if they don't, we shouldn't have it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So you set out quite a number of what you think are the necessary ingredients for getting into a better formula. I think another one that you allude to in the book is this notion of judicial self-restraint by the independent agencies themselves. Now, a lot of your recommendations are terms of reference, formal structural recommendations. This one seems to be almost more psychological or a cultural one. How do you go about instilling that judicial self-restraint?
So it's brilliant that you picked that up, because you're absolutely right that the book is it's not quite about hard law, but it is about something you could codify. And then it gets to the last couple of chapters and it says, oh, but actually even that's not going to be enough. You need these people to exercise self-restraint, and that can only be a norm that is kind of deeply embedded in the community. And our judges are good on that. I mean, I think if one of our judges intervened in an election in the way that Justice Ginsburg intervened in the last US presidential election, I think there would be a real uproar here. I mean, Lady Hale, who's now the president of the Supreme Court, had a bit of a hard time just because she'd given a speech about Europe in Southeast Asia. I think by talking about it, actually, by think tanks and parliamentarians and the media talking about it, I give a few examples of where central bankers have talked, I think, out of turn. But it doesn't matter that I think they talked out of turn. Their societies did. When Janet Yellen first became chair of the Federal Reserve, she went up to Boston and gave a speech on inequality. And in the speech, she didn't really talk about how Fed policy bore on that or how it affected the Federal Reserve. And actually, she could have done that, and I think it's sad she didn't. The effect of it in Washington was, it just shows they are a democrat institution, and we've always known. And there was a certain amount of private hair pulling by some of the most sober senior Fed officials I'd known. Raghu Rajan, who was governor of the Central Bank of India for a while, he started giving speeches about the importance of tolerance, which were taken to be, and I think were intended to be, not very coded messages about Hindus should be nice to Muslims. Well, and the part of the Hindu nationalist elite were outraged, and he wasn't reappointed. And he wasn't reappointed because they thought that he had stepped beyond the bounds. And part of what I want to say is, it's a very peculiar thing. When you occupy these offices, you are given this power, and you are given a platform. And we need a culture that you won't use the platform. You won't use it for things except what's clearly relevant to what you do. And haven't got time now, but I draw on examples from the military and the judiciary to try and chart how central banking is a bit like one, and a bit like the other.
You make your argument, obviously, on grounds of political values and on constitutionalism, but you've also clearly got some regard for questions of efficiency.
Oh, yeah.
We're 10 years on from the financial crisis. Do you think that this particular setup entails specific or specifically heightened systemic risk?
In the UK or around the world?
Oh, either.
In the UK, I would say, this is, we shouldn't take any notice of anything I say, but in particular this, because as I said, I'm the architect. I think the Bank of England powers and architecture are reasonably well designed. I have one concern about them, which is that the Financial Policy Committee has voted unanimously on everything over, and I said at an event there that I found it implausible that they had agreed on everything for 7 years. I might or might not be right about that. What I am more confident of normatively is the unanimity has made it harder for the Select Committee to oversee them. One of the things I realized, not immediately, but quite quickly about the MPC, is that what minority votes do is they help the public understand where the debate is. And you and I go along to the Select Committee, and somebody says, well, what do you think about that, Mr. King? And you say your thing. And then they say, do you agree with that, Mr. Tucker? It doesn't seem to fit with your vote at all, or the reason you gave for your vote. And suddenly, they've got something that the members of the Select Committee know more than most parliamentarians and more than most members of the public, but they're not specialists. And voting and disagreement helps them hone in on where the debate is, and that has not been happening on finance. If you know, 9 of you turn up and, oh yes, we all agree, it's all, it's much harder for them to create the kind of debate that's needed.
So unanimity undermines precisely the credibility that independent agencies are meant to amplify through their work. Yeah.
I think it does, yeah. I think it does. I think disagreement helps accountability.
And then, have you seen a model internationally, a setup that you like? Is there a country out there that's got a good template in terms of striking these various balances?
For agencies in general, I think the country that has been most thoughtful about this in recent years is France. And you know, one of the nice things about getting old is that you discover you've got prejudices that you're still shedding. So this is not what I expected. Let me mention 3 or 4 things about France that I think are quite striking. First of all, whether or not independent agencies fitted into their constitution. Their constitution provides for the delegation of regulation-making power to the Prime Minister and other ministers. And a case went to the Constitutional Court about whether or not you could have independent agencies. And the answer was that you could. But if they were going to be independent, they really were going to be independent. So there are no override powers in France of the kind, whereas override powers have been the solution to everything. You know, every sponsoring minister wants a whole battery of override powers. Here, I'm being slightly unfair, but that's the shape of it. Whereas the Constitutional Court, they said, no. This is quite good in terms of the incentives. You know, don't assembly president create an independent agency only to kind of give yourself backdoor controls. If you make them independent, you will mean it. Conseil d'État, because as you know, they have a separate system. The top administrative law court, they said things that were quite constraining as well. But none of that stood in the way of the French Senate a few years ago, getting really fed up about the independent agencies and wrote a report kind of completely, slightly over the top, saying they're an abomination and there were far too many of them and this, that, and the other. When the dust had settled, the Assembly, which is more powerful in their setup, and the executive came up with a new framework law for independent agencies, including some criteria for what kind of the circumstances in which an agency could reasonably be independent. And the consequence of that was, I can't remember whether it was 5 or 6 agencies had their independence taken away, because when examined against these criteria, as part of that, of course it was coterminous, these things, it was, well, these people shouldn't be independent. Actually, some of the Senate complaints had been right, and I thought, my goodness, we haven't been through anything like that here. The Institute of Government has issued a few reports that get into this space, and everyone said, oh, those are really interesting and important, but no one has picked it up in Whitehall or Westminster in the way that from a distance I observe in France. I think America has got worse problems than us, but of a slightly different nature.
Good, we'll open it up to the floor. I'd like to wait until the microphone reaches you, and then for the benefit of the speaker, just introduce yourself.
Hello, Robert Foster. I used to work at the then Competition Commission, CE there, and I was wondering if you could say what you think is the value of the role of, say, the appeal system. There it's the Competition Appeal Tribunal. Now, the interesting thing, you know, vis-a-vis, you mentioned Ofcom, is that as well as the sort of judicial review function, it's possible to get specialist, say, economic input from the CMA as part of the knowledge base of the tribunal. And is that sort of approach, do you think, something that could be used more widely for so-called independent agencies?
So, I'll try to speak while I'm sifting through for something. I'm looking for a quote from one of the former heads of the tribunal. I have a slight concern about the tribunal system. Let me back up a bit. The competition authority should be independent because you want to commit to fair adjudication of competition disputes, and I think the Treasury were instrumental under Labour actually in pushing for an independent competition authority. I think there is a sad story in the Western world about the framing of objectives for competition authorities, where the driving force was the United States, but the rest of us have inhaled. And you will know this better than me, but the language of the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act, but I think it's the Sherman Act in this case that really mattered, are vague. And doctrine in the FTC and the Department of Justice, Antitrust Division, and courts more generally in the United States for a long time turned on a whole set of per se rules, which I'm going to, this is going to be a caricature. If A merges with B and they're going to have a market share of over X, it's per se illegal. So the burden of proof was the other way around. And the great Chicago school debate, starting from the 60s, going into the 80s, why Robert Bork didn't get confirmed as, one of the reasons he didn't get confirmed as a Supreme Court justice, was they said, well, all this is absolute nonsense. Instead, it ought to be about welfare, and in particular, will this merger of A and B, will it push prices down and volumes up, which actually is pretty good. And then the generation of John Vickers and your generation has improved on that further. What bothers me about that is it happened entirely via the court system. There is no consultative paper that comes out of the executive branch of government. There is no debate in Congress about this. And yet, did this change the course of competition policy in the States? I mean, absolutely fundamentally. Frankly, did it change the shape of American business? Yeah, absolutely fundamentally. You wouldn't have as many big businesses in the States if they had stuck with the Harvard School rule. I am, in terms of my own project, I am less interested in the merits of the substantive policy than that was this a change in high-level policy, vague term, but I think this was a shift in high-level policy, and the high-level policy should have had a democratic imprimatur on it, and it didn't. And much a kind of diluted version of that happened in Europe. I talked to some of the people who had been in the Commission at the time that pushed this through, and they said, "Oh yes, we pushed that through." And I said, "Well, shouldn't you have kind of ensured that there was kind of broad support for it?" Now, it wasn't quite as bad because they did consult on it. On the tribunal, I have a concern, which is a few people I talked to, or quite a few people I talked to, both around CMA and some of the other agencies, more or less said, well, of course, really, it's the tribunal that decides policy. Because once a case has gone up to them, the principle in it we wouldn't want to go against. So here's the quote I was looking for. Where Parliament has established such a specialist appellate tribunal in a particular field, its expertise should be used to best effect, I'm going to read slowly now, to shape and direct the development of law and practice in that field. Well, I know what a policymaker sounds like because I was one. That's what a policymaker sounds like. Now, is that a bad thing? Well, the thing that's interesting about it, and I think uncomfortable, is that partly because this country made the choice that the tribunal members would be judges. Australia, as I'm sure you know, decided that they wouldn't be judges. Partly because they are judges. There's no question of them testifying to a select committee on their policy. And I think, well, why should I testify on regulatory policy? And the members of the tribunal don't have to testify on the way they shape competition policy. And so I do think, actually, I think America has got this better. The appeal is within the agencies in the United States, and then there can be judicial review. And as you will know, there are periods where judicial review in the States, the hard look approach, gets more into substantive merits, but normally it gets pulled back from that, and the Supreme Court has tended to slap down the DC Appeals Court when they've got too far into merits. And I would rather have the judges do the integrity of processes and substance, merits, policy, done by people that can be brought in front of Congress or the Commons, not overruled, but, you know, bloody hell, why is that your policy? Oh, I see, all right. Or, you know, we're going to have to make a change. I think the effect of the tribunal system being judicial and being protected by, you can't really challenge them, is that it takes out of public debate things that in a democracy should be part of public debate. Not the individual decisions, and not the adjudicatory decisions, but the general policy that develops over time.
Yes, please. We have about 10 minutes more, I think, for Q&A. If anybody else wants to get my attention, please raise your hand.
My name is Richard Sanders, and I'm a member of Chatham House. I might be wrong here, but I seem to remember that the independence of at least setting interest rates to the Bank of England was given to the Bank of England by Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer under a Labour government, which in some senses is perhaps slightly counterintuitive. Do you think, and as far as I understand it, that situation has not changed, that still the Monetary Policy Committee has independence over the setting of interest rates?
Hope so.
And so could you explain the mindset of Gordon Brown at the time for doing so? And do you think it was a good idea, and do you think that there might be some change subsequent to maybe a different government be elected?
It's very interesting what you say about somehow that's counterintuitive. And what you said is absolutely the orthodoxy in political science. The political science orthodoxy is that what politicians do depend upon who their constituency is, their backers, who pays for them in the United States, and therefore you'd expect a conservative government, small c conservative government, to favour central bank independence, and a more left-leaning government not to. And the argument is, well, and a conservative government will do this because they want to lock in their policy. Chile is an example of this at the level of constitutional politics. And it's very, very interesting because the political scientists, these people study politics, and they've got the richness of politics completely wrong, which is politics, certainly in a parliamentary system, but even in the state system, it's competition. You basically want to beat the other side. And you don't expect to win all the time. So actually the evaluation is, so yes, this isn't a good system, we're going to mess it up. And the question is, are we going to mess it up more than the other side, or are they going to mess it up more than us? So if you're a conservative, you do not want to make the Bank of England independent, because you know that eventually, damn it, you'll get voted out and Labour will get voted in, but they're bound to spend too much and tax too little and borrow too much and let inflation get out of control. And in fact, that's the corrective device that will bring you back into power. In those circumstances, the party that will grant central bank independence is a party that, from the left, that knows that their broader movement faces that hazard. So then the interesting question is, well, if that's the right way around, why, when the Conservatives get back in, here or elsewhere, why don't they undo it? And that depends upon whether there were really benefits to monetary independence. And at least as measured by the yield curve, and for the finance economists amongst you, there was a fall in risk premium of about 25 basis points, which is about 10% of the real rate of interest, which is ginormous. And I mean, absolutely ginormous in terms of the public finances. And if this is a benefit, whoever's in government, if you're on the right, you can have tax cuts. If you're on the left, you can spend more. But it means that when Labour go in and grant independence, the Tories have got very little incentive to remove it when they get back in, because crudely, in terms of day-to-day newspapers, if they do that, bond yields will go back up, and immediately people are saying, damn, there's going to have to be a tax rise. And our view, certainly Eddie George's view, from the moment that Gordon Brown and Tony Blair did that, was that central bank independence in this country would not be embedded until there was a Tory government and And they in 1997, they opposed Bank of England independence and voted against it. And Peter Lilly, who was the then Shadow Chancellor, gave speeches in the House saying, fine people down at Threadneedle Street and all of that. But actually, Bank of England independence was a violation of our deep political values because there couldn't be accountability. There is a debate now. I don't want to say too much about this because I don't know enough about it. There is a debate now about giving the Bank of England lots more functions, targeting productivity growth, etc. One of my criteria that I didn't highlight is you should only delegate functions with powers where the instrument you've delegated can be reliably expected to achieve its target. So in setting a target for productivity growth, you can monitor against that. Well, was productivity growth X% this year or not? The question in that case is, have you actually got instruments that could reliably be expected to achieve the target? Apparently they were asked about this in the Select Committee last week, and I hope that's the answer that they gave.
Yes, please.
John Bishop, Chatham House member. Can't resist on following up by asking how, going back to the grant of independence to the central bank, but at the same time hiving off banking supervision into what seemed to be a much less experienced agency, fits into your general thesis or doesn't, because it seemed that practically it would have been better to have left that with the Bank of England, at least from a macro standpoint. But that was not done, and arguably you'd be more in favour of separating these things.
Well, that's a very great question. And so, in a sense, I spend some time on this in the book, because you can make a question of if you start off concerned about concentrations of power, you say we don't want this in the central bank because it make them too powerful. The FSA, by the way, had too many. It would fail that test too, because it had kind of supreme power and everything financial, and that didn't go so well. I actually think central banks should be involved in banking supervision. I don't think one can make a completely compelling case that they should be the only body that's involved in banking supervision and regulation. But I think it's incredibly difficult to take them out of it for this reason. Because of their monetary powers, they're inevitably the lender of last resort, which means that they will be at the scene of almost any financial disaster, and lending to firms or not lending or whatever. And they need to know something, really know something about the firms to whom they're lending and how to do all of that. So a complete separation where the central bank becomes completely isolated from supervision and regulation, frankly leads to the kind of disaster that we had with Northern Rock in 2007. And all I can say is that had the crisis come 10 years later, this country would have been even less equipped to cope. Initially in the Bank of England, the only people that were useful were over 45, or maybe over 40, and all of them had been involved in supervision in the past. We got some people out of retirement. The clever young people learnt quickly. It's a very talented place. So I don't think that you can take the central bank out of banking stability and supervision, so long as they're the lender of last resort. Now, very interestingly, this is probably the only occasion I'll say this, and seeing Ian in the room, very interesting, the chief ideologist of the FSA in the late 1990s, who'd been, I suppose, my great friend and rival in my generation of Bank of England people, he wrote papers under Howard's encouragement saying, although the Bank of England should implement lender of last resort, it should actually be a decision of Treasury Ministers on recommendation from the FSA. So they had thought through this. I mean, I'm not surprised that Clive had thought through this point. It was a disgrace of an argument, actually, because it says, for another reason, because it says that the governing people who govern the Bank of England shouldn't be responsible for the risks on their balance sheet, which I think would be a terrible mistake. So I think the UK, people criticise, I want to say something personal at this point, people criticise Mervyn a lot about reducing the Bank of England's involvement in financial stability and things like that. And he and I are friends. We've had bigger disagreements than anyone will ever know about. But it is true that he played that down relative to Eddie, and I believe he made a mistake. What is rarely said is there is also no doubt that the FSA leadership were trying to push the Bank of England out of that territory, and also that the Treasury were perfectly happy with the Bank of England to pull back and the Treasury to kind of push and raising it. I went to a deputy governor once and said, this is all a mess. And I was told to grow up. You know, this was the zeitgeist was, you know, that if he turns it into a monetary institute, that is what is wanted. And that was to be blind to the fact that the central bank is the lender of last resort and can't be bereft of human capital and information and skill when it comes to it. It also turned out to be rather ambitious to try and I think the FSA could have been a mistake if they had merged fewer organisations into it. I think they got greedy. That will upset some of my friends saying that, but it's what I've believed since it happened, and one day I had to say it, and I just did.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We covered a huge amount of ground. I'm sure you'd be happy to continue the conversation at the book table.
Absolutely.
For now, please join me in thanking support.
Thank you
for
for
the
coming.
talk.